Hey everyone, welcome back to Threaducation. Today I'm back talking about the history of one of the most influential designers in recent memory, Issey Miyake. As I'm sure many of you know, Miyake passed away just this past August, so I figured now is a good time to take a step back and look at everything that he accomplished throughout his career in the fashion industry. So without further ado, let's get into it. This is the history of Issey Miyake. In 1938, Issey Miyake was born in Hiroshima, Japan. Politically speaking, this was a turbulent time to be born because it was just 1 year before the start of World War II, but the worst was yet to come. In 1945, when Miyake was just 7 years old, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It's estimated that the attack killed more than 70,000 people, but by some miracle, he was not among them. He was, however, there to witness the chaos, and later in his life he'd go on to say, "When I close my eyes, I still see things no one should ever experience. A bright red light, the black clouds soon after, people running in every direction desperately trying to escape. I remember it all." Unfortunately, his mother died of radiation poisoning just 3 years later, as did many of the people he'd grown up around. This was devastating to say the least, but Miyake actually credited this traumatic experience with pushing him towards the arts. Although he was unable to afford actual paintbrushes, he found that finger painting was a therapeutic source of self-expression that, unlike many of the other things in his life at the time, gave him a sense of peace. This was his introduction to the world of art, but where things really took a turn was his discovery of Isamu Noguchi, the world-renowned sculptor who'd been commissioned to help design a new bridge in Hiroshima. This bridge, which would become known as the Peace Bridge, was being rebuilt because the original had been destroyed during the bombing, and Noguchi was tasked with creating handrails that inspired a sense of optimism. To that end, he designed long concrete handrails that spread up and out as opposed to sinking into the ground. It's a simple yet powerful metaphor, and it's one that resonated quite strongly with Miyake, who was, unsurprisingly, desperate for any sense of optimism that he could get. Beyond that, though, he was intrigued by the idea that art could be used to invoke a sense of emotion, which is a concept that would stick with him for the rest of his life. Now, Miyake wouldn't follow in Noguchi's footsteps by becoming a sculptor, but he did have his mind set on a career in the arts, and after coming across a few of his sister's magazines, he started to take a particular interest in fashion design. When he was old enough, he enrolled in Tokyo's Tama University to study graphic design, and while this wasn't necessarily a traditional education in fashion design, many of the skills were transferable. While enrolled there, Miyake decided to enter a design competition at Bunka Fashion College, which is one of the most prestigious design schools in the world. It was a bit of a rude awakening for him though, because he ended up losing the competition, and the feedback he received was that he lacked a lot of these so-called traditional design skills like pattern making. In other words, he had the conceptual piece down and the designs he put on paper were fantastic, but he didn't have what it took to actually execute these designs. He took this feedback to heart and realized that he did in fact have room for improvement. So after graduating from Tama University in 1963, he decided to move to Paris, where he began studying the art of Parisian couture. It goes without saying that the move to Paris was a big decision for him, but it ended up being one of the most formative experiences in the early part of his career. While studying there, he had the opportunity to work as an apprentice for both Guy Laroche, a French designer running his own eponymous label, and then Hubert de Givenchy, who is obviously the founder of Givenchy. This served as Miyake's formal introduction to the art of couture, and under the wings of Laroche and de Givenchy, he was practicing it at the highest level, but he wasn't entirely sold on the idea that this style of design was right for him. Back in the 1960s, French couturiers were largely the ones controlling the conversation in Europe's fashion scene. But what you have to remember here is that Issey Miyake was coming in with an outsider's perspective. He was a graphic designer from Japan who knew more about art than he knew about cutting and sewing garments, and even though he's the one who made the decision to go to Paris to learn these things, it's entirely possible that he arrived there with some inherent skepticism. Whether or not that's true, there's really no way to know, but what we do know is that in 1968, he came to the realization that couture was simply not for him. The catalyst for this realization is actually quite interesting. You see, in May of 1968, While Miyake was still in Paris, a series of protests erupted as groups of French citizens spoke out against the government's proclivity towards capitalist and consumerist policies. In other words, they were arguing that the French economy favored those at the top, while doing too little to support those at the bottom. And to say that they were arguing might even be an understatement, because the protests were so severe that the president of France actually had to flee the country. So why am I mentioning all of this? Well, it's no secret that the French couture designers were mostly catering to the wants and needs of the rich, and that didn't sit too well with Miyake, who himself had come from humble beginnings. In a later interview, he cited the 1968 protests as a turning point for him and said the world was moving beyond the needs of haute couture for the few and towards simple, more universal elements such as jeans and t-shirts. With that in mind, he changed course in 1969 by moving to New York City, and this too would be a formative experience for him. Unlike France, where couture was still controlling much of the conversation, American fashion in the late 1960s and early 1970s was beginning to rely heavily upon these aforementioned universal elements like jeans and t-shirts. During his time in New York, Miyake studied English at Columbia University and worked as an assistant for the American designer Geoffrey Beene, a designer that embraced American style. Now, beyond learning more about American style, one of the reasons that working with Geoffrey Beene was so crucial to Miyake's development was that he was really the first non-couture designer that he'd worked with. In the past, he'd been studying under couturiers making one-of-one, highly detailed garments, but now here he was studying under a ready-to-wear designer whose work was made for the masses. This is exactly what Miyake had been looking for, but unfortunately, his time in the US would be cut short. Although he'd survived the attack, radiation from the atomic bomb dropped on Japan gave him lifelong medical complications, and when he started feeling sick in 1969, he knew that he needed to return to Japan for treatment. Obviously, this was upsetting, but Miyake had learned at a very young age that you need to make the best out of every situation that you find yourself in, and that's exactly what he did. By this point, he had earned a degree in graphic design, he'd worked alongside the likes of Hubert de Givenchy in France, and he'd studied the art of ready-to-wear alongside the American designer Geoffrey Beene. So now, at the age of 32, he found himself back home in Japan, and he knew that it was finally time to do what he had deep down been planning to do this whole time. At long last, he was ready to launch his own label. In 1970, Issey Miyake officially launched Miyake Design Studio. For his first collection, he made a few different pieces, but the real standout was a coat that he'd embroidered using the sashiko stitching technique. Sashiko is a traditional Japanese stitching technique where the clothing, which is almost always either blue or red, is stitched with white thread in a way that it presents on the cloth in the form of a repeating pattern. It's a simple marriage of design and functionality, but it's easy to see why people like it so much. Now, like I said, sashiko is a traditional Japanese stitching technique, so even though the design was great, it wasn't all that groundbreaking in Japan, but where it was groundbreaking was back in the United States. You see, during the brief time that he was there, Miyake had made a few friends in the local New York fashion scene, and one of them offered to give him some help. They arranged a meeting with the buyers at the world-famous department store Bloomingdale's, and it just so happens that they were ecstatic about his work. So much so, in fact, that they offered Miyake a small section of the store to display his pieces, which is almost unheard of for a new designer's first collection. Needless to say, he was off to a great start, but where things really started taking shape was Paris in 1973, which is when he first started presenting seasonal collections at Fashion Week. Now, you're probably wondering how he made the jump from having a section at Bloomingdale's to getting on the Fashion Week schedule, and that's a fair question because the circumstances here were a bit unique. We talked about how the last time that Miyake was in France, he, among many others, were beginning to notice the need for a push towards ready-to-wear. Designer fashion was no longer just for the rich and famous, it was for the masses too, and that was the appeal of ready-to-wear. So to put it simply, many people were looking at ready-to-wear as the future, and that's why they were willing to take a chance by putting some relatively inexperienced, yet promising ready-to-wear designers like Issey Miyake on the Fashion Week lineup. Just to be clear, he did have experience, but what I mean is that he'd only been running his eponymous label for a few years at that point, and he hadn't really made a name for himself yet. That was all about to change, however, because right from the jump, Miyake was able to differentiate himself from the crowd. Something that I really want to emphasize here is that even though I'm saying his goal with ready-to-wear was to create something that appealed to the masses, his designs were far from what you would call simple. In fact, Issey Miyake is widely considered to be one of the founding fathers of Japanese avant-garde fashion. He liked to experiment with silhouettes and materials in ways that no one had ever really seen before, and I think he was able to do this because of his unique background. Having grown up in Japan, his foundation was Japanese fashion. His time spent studying couture in France gave him an acute sense of detail and taught him more about how clothes actually sit on the body, and his time spent studying ready-to-wear in America taught him how to create pieces that people could actually wear during the course of everyday life. So the bottom line was that even though Issey Miyake was a new face on the Fashion Week circuit, and I guess the fashion industry as a whole, it quickly became apparent that there was nobody else quite like him. For that reason, he garnered quite a bit of attention, and before long, he was really starting to build a following for himself. While at first he was only doing women's wear collections, he expanded his audience by introducing menswear collections as well, and by 1975, there was enough demand for his clothing that he decided to open up the very first Issey Miyake boutique in Paris. I really can't overstate how big of a deal this was, because opening this boutique was a testament to the fact that he had broken into the French fashion market, which is a notoriously difficult thing to do. He wasn't the only one doing this, but he was among the first. Designers like Rei Kawakubo and Yohji Yamamoto would eventually join him as the faces of Japanese fashion, but it's worth noting that neither of them presented collections in Paris until 1981, so Miyake really was the one forging the path. That said, there came a point where designers like Miyake, Kawakubo, Yamamoto, and Kenzo Takada were all becoming popular around the same time. And this sort of had a snowball effect because it made people more and more aware of the influence that Japanese fashion was beginning to have on the industry as a whole. I guess you could even say that this was the start of a Japanese fashion movement within the industry, and while I want to emphasize the fact that a designer's identity should never be reduced to the place that they're from, there is no denying that this new wave of designers from Japan was particularly intent upon challenging the status quo. None more so than Issey Miyake, who was constantly thinking of new approaches to design. One of the best examples of this was a collection that he put out in 1982 called Bodyworks, where he created silhouettes using common materials that most people would never think to make clothing with, including plastic, metal, and even glass. This was obviously more conceptual than it was practical, but he was thinking about ways to experiment with practical wearable clothing as well, and by the late 1980s, he came up with one idea that would change everything. By the late 1980s, Issey Miyake had experimented with countless different design techniques, but he caught the attention of fashion fans everywhere in 1988 when he debuted his newest innovation, pleated clothing. Now, as I alluded to earlier, Miyake always had a fascination with the way that clothing sits on the body, and with that in mind, he began thinking of ways that he could alter fabric so that it not only looked, but also felt and moved differently when you wore it. The idea that he arrived at was to alter the fabric with a technique known as pleating, but being the out-of-the-box thinker that he was, he took an approach that no one had ever taken before. For context, the pleating technique has pretty much been around forever, and in its simplest form, it involves stitching and even heating fabric so that it retains a series of folds. Typically speaking, designers will make pleated clothing by first pleating the actual fabric, and then cutting the pleated fabric into the shape of whatever garment they're trying to make. But Issey Miyake took a look at this process and realized it didn't have to be that way. Instead, he started by taking 2 to 3 times more fabric than he actually needed, and he used it to construct an oversized garment. And then, only once that was done did he go through the process of carefully folding, sewing, and ironing the fabric to give it that pleated look. The brilliance of this is that because he was pleating the fabric after the clothes were made as opposed to before, he had far more control over how intricate the details were, and could adjust things like the size and direction of each fold. So even though pleating was by itself not a new concept, no one had ever seen it done the way that Miyake was doing it, and trust me when I tell you that it set the fashion world ablaze. Make no mistake, Miyake was already quite popular, and at this point he had already been on the Fashion Week circuit for nearly a decade, but his pleated clothing took him to an entirely new level. They became such a sensation that in 1994, just to create a degree of separation between his main line and this one technique, he decided to launch a new line called Pleats Please, which, as the name implies, focused solely on pleated clothing. Looking back now, the creation of Pleats Please is clearly one of the crowning achievements in Issey Miyake's career, not just because of how popular the line became, but also because it was the culmination of everything that he'd been working towards. Ever since his days as a couturier, he'd been fascinated with the idea of creating high-end garments that complemented the person wearing them, but over time, he shifted his focus to ready-to-wear, because he wanted to make something comfortable that people could wear every day, and with Pleats Please, he did all of that and more. His pleated clothing line could be made with as little as one piece of fabric, it could be reworn countless times, and it could even be washed without becoming wrinkled. But at the same time, the designs were something to behold. They could be worn on the runway just as easily as they could be worn to go grab groceries, and that's a large part of the reason that they appeal to so many people. In the coming years, the name Issey Miyake would become nearly synonymous with pleated clothing, but this is not the only product line of his that exploded in popularity during the 1990s. Something common in the fashion industry that I don't think I've ever really talked about on the channel is that many labels have their own perfume lines. Generally speaking, fashion is a medium through which you present yourself to others, and the same can be said for perfume, so I guess this makes sense. And around the same time that he was launching Pleats Please, Miyake decided that he wanted to try making a fragrance of his own. To be fair, it wasn't entirely his own because he did work closely with experienced perfumer Jacques Cavalier to perfect the scent, but in the end, the outcome was a perfume that he called L'eau d'Issey. L'eau d'Issey is French for the water of Issey, and that's because his inspiration was to create something that brought to mind the smell of water on skin. Perhaps that's a bit specific, but in essence, it's a refreshing floral perfume, and to say that people loved it would be an understatement. It's possible that you've never even heard of it before, because generally speaking, many people, myself included, tend to forget about perfumes when talking about their favorite fashion brands, but from a commercial standpoint, L'eau d'Issey was far and away one of Miyake's best-selling products, period. The profit margins on a successful perfume are also typically much higher than clothing, simply because the cost of production is different, so the introduction of this perfume line had a noticeable impact on Miyake's balance sheet, and it enabled him to continue pursuing other projects. For instance, in the late 1990s, he finally introduced APOC, which is an idea that he'd been toying around with since the 70s. APOC, which stands for a piece of clothing, is arguably one of Issey Miyake's most experimental endeavors. In collaboration with designer Dai Fujiwara, Miyake created a system where a single piece of fabric could be fed into an industrial weaving machine, and that single piece of fabric would then be used to create 3D clothing. It's a bit hard to explain, so don't worry if that doesn't make complete sense, and instead take a look at these photos from the 1999 runway show where Miyake first used this APOC system. It may look like these models are just wearing dresses that have been stitched together, but in reality, they're all wearing the same exact dress made from one continuous piece of fabric. So like the name implies, it's not multiple pieces of clothing, it's a piece of clothing. There are of course practical applications for the APOC system because you can create wearable clothing, but if you ask me, its capabilities are best demonstrated in instances like the one you see here on the runway, or even in an art exhibit. Either way, this should really drive home the fact that Issey Miyake was one of the most innovative minds that the fashion industry has ever seen. Not only is he able to dream up these mind-bending concepts, but he's able to coordinate the strategy and technology needed to execute them. And in the end, that's what matters if you want to share those concepts with the world. By all accounts, Miyake had accomplished everything he'd set out to do, but even still, his drive for innovation only grew stronger with time. And interestingly enough, this is actually what led him to step down as the creative director of his eponymous label in 1999. On one hand, he wanted someone with a fresh perspective to come in and take his place, which is why he appointed his longtime friend and collaborator Naoki Takezawa as creative director. And then, on the other hand, he wanted more time to focus on cool, new exciting projects like APOC. Of course, he would still be heavily involved in the label, but in many ways, this was the end of one era and the start of another. A telltale sign of the fact that Issey Miyake was a truly iconic designer is that his work earned the admiration of those well outside of the fashion industry. And perhaps the best example of this is none other than Steve Jobs. As the story goes, Miyake had been commissioned by the Japanese tech conglomerate Sony to create uniforms for their factory workers. Beige and unbranded, the uniforms were quite simple, but they were functional, had removable sleeves in case the factory became too hot, and most importantly, they invoked a sense of unity among the workers. Or at least that was the goal. Anyways, it was during a business trip to Japan that Jobs had the opportunity to tour Sony's factories, and upon seeing the uniforms, he knew that he wanted something similar for his employees. He asked and was told that the uniforms were designed by Issey Miyake, and so Jobs gave Miyake a call to get the process started. After going back and forth on a few different design concepts, they arrived at a vest for Apple employees to wear, but Jobs recalls that when he presented the vests to the company, he was quite literally booed off stage. And that probably explains why there aren't any pictures of the vest on the internet. If you can find one, let me know, but as far as I'm concerned, they were so poorly received that they never saw the light of day. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the design was bad, it could just be that Apple employees didn't want to wear a vest. Whatever the truth is, the one thing we know is that this misfire wasn't the end of the relationship between Issey Miyake and Steve Jobs. In fact, it was the beginning of a friendship. To be honest, it actually makes perfect sense, because they not only shared a deep passion for design, but they shared a deep passion for the ways that people interact with design, whether it be a pair of pleated pants or the interface of an iPhone. So even though Jobs' employees vetoed a uniform, he decided to adopt one of his own. There was this one particular black turtleneck Miyake made that Jobs was a big fan of, and when he asked Miyake to send him a few, he ended up receiving a delivery of nearly 100. Jobs later recalled thinking that he'd been given enough to wear every day for the rest of his life, and that's exactly what he did. He wore the black turtleneck every day up until his death in 2011, and nowadays, when people think of Steve Jobs, that is almost always what they picture him wearing. Most of them not even knowing it was designed by Issey Miyake. And I'll also note that Miyake retired this design upon Steve's death to honor his memory. So anyways, Miyake spent the 2000s launching new projects like the Issey Miyake Foundation. He focused on helping other designers launch new sub-labels under his umbrella, and took time to give guidance to Naoki Takezawa, who served as creative director of the main line until 2007, and then Dai Fujiwara, who replaced Takezawa as creative director and still holds that title today. The point here is that even though Issey Miyake stepped down as the creative director back in 1999, he did so knowing that the label was positioned to remain relevant in the fashion industry and beyond for a long time to come. So far it has, and I sincerely believe that it will continue to. Miyake passed away on August 5th of 2022, and it was undoubtedly painful for fashion to lose one of its giants. But I think we can take comfort in the fact that what he created was timeless, and the things that he accomplished during his career opened the door for a generation of new designers. So that covers everything for this video. Hopefully by now you understand why Issey Miyake is so highly regarded in the fashion industry. If you liked this video and want to see others like it, please make sure that you like, comment, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram for more fashion content. Other than that, thank you all for watching Threaducation, and I will see you next time.